Hello and welcome to Protocol's event on building smart cities. I'm Tammy Wincup, president of Protocol, and I appreciate you joining us. Today, we want to zoom out on the role that technology is playing, not simply in the enterprise or for individual consumers, but in how we might use technology in the cities and towns where we live and work, and the technology pitfalls we should avoid. We hope that you'll add your questions to our conversation via Twitter at hashtag Protocol Policy. We're looking forward to a great conversation that Protocol Editor-at-Large David Pierce has ahead. But first, we want to set the stage in thinking about the technology enabling us to even have this conversation. I'm thrilled to welcome Qualcomm CEO Cristiano Amon to set that stage. While he has just recently taken over as CEO, he is a company veteran, including most recently serving as president, where he steered Qualcomm's product roadmap, 5G strategy, and global acceleration. Welcome. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Tammy. Happy to be here. Happy to be part of this conversation.
Well, we appreciate it. Let's set the stage together. Let's start with 5G. As it's really at the center of the promise of digital transformation for our communities. I'd love for you to just start and tell us, what do you see as the most important changes that are actually finally really here in place from 5G advancement?
Well, it's a longer conversation because 5G will touch so many things, but I want to start by probably simplifying the answer and saying what we're going to see when we have 5G fully deployed. And it's starting right now. We're starting to, we see its deployment in all the metropolitan areas, some of the dense urban, some of the largest cities in the United States and around the globe. When it's fully deployed, connectivity to the internet and to the cloud will be the norm. The exception will be this is not connected. And that's how we should think about 5G. Everything, everyone will be connected 100% of the time. And we're going to talk about things that are going to be different or the exception if they're not connected. And with that, we're going to see big transformation. There's many examples, from industrial, from healthcare, to what's going to happen to transportation. Think about all the different cars connected to each other, connected to all the pedestrians, how we should think about navigation and autonomy and all of that. And even how we're going to think about the workplace as we go, back to what is the new vision of the workplace. So that's all happening. We're at the beginning of that transition, but it's about having everything connected to the cloud 100% of the time.
And as you think about Qualcomm's products in that journey, you're pervasive, right? Your products are everywhere, but often behind the scenes. Will you give us a peek behind that curtain in terms of where you're hoping to take the company in that digital transformation and what role you are playing and hope to play?
Yes, this is one of the most exciting times for Qualcomm in the history of our company. We have probably well known for our role in wireless and in the mobile industry. Yes, we are the company behind the glass of the smartphone. I think we are, even though we're not everybody knows about Qualcomm, we are part of everybody's lives. When you look at the smartphone revolution we have today, Qualcomm technology is in every phone, Qualcomm chips in a very large number of phones today. But what's happening to Qualcomm right now is 5G is no longer unique to the telecommunication industry. It's going to be an essential technology. It's going to be critical infrastructure, and it's going to have an impact on a number of industries. And that is truly creating an opportunity for Qualcomm to expand. And we're already seeing that happening today. Nobody will normally think of Qualcomm, if you think about a few years ago, about an automotive company. Right now, we're working with 23 of the 26 car brands. No, people will not think about Qualcomm as a company driving digital transformation and retail. And we are. If you look at what happened in the pandemic, money disappear. You have an acceleration of digitization of payments, handheld devices, how people are going to do things a different way. And we are, working on a transformation of the industry. You now think of Qualcomm as the company working with the industrial leaders in Europe for the factory of the future. So this is creating an incredible opportunity for Qualcomm to expand. I have the privilege and the opportunity to be the CEO of Qualcomm at this time for the company. And at the end of the day, besides being the company that is known for mobile, we want to be the company that is owned by driving this intelligently connected edge of devices that are connected to the cloud using 5G.
So that's a lot of, I mean, you're touching on a lot of different industries, a lot of different pieces you just talked about there, from retail to cars to factories, et cetera. Today's, and David and his panel is going to dive in on really the smart city and what does it look like for municipalities to partner with technology companies in this transformation. You mentioned a little bit about where 5G is hopefully going to take us in those municipalities in the future. But can you say a little more about how cities need to be working with tech companies and what that looks like? What are the next steps that we should be seeing in these smart cities?
By the way, this is a great topic of conversation, and I'll say as a general statement, cities that traditionally have not, work with a lot of technology companies are now being transformed by technology and 5G. We look at this conversation of smart cities. For example, if you go to a city administration, often you're not going to find a CTO. Now it's likely a position that we're going to see as you look of technology transformation of cities and some of the basic services that we see in city. I can give a couple of examples.
Right.
One example is what we see happening in transportation, and we all want efficient transportation. And one of the technologies coming from 5G is what we call cellular V2X. So it basically means vehicle to vehicle, vehicle to pedestrian, vehicle to infrastructure. So think about traffic lights. Traffic lights become smart traffic lights. Every vehicle is connected to it. When you're driving, you know how many seconds to green. You know how to adjust your speed so you can get a green wave. You know if there's a possible hazard at the intersection, and that can inform you directly on your dashboard. You know the direction of traffic of all different cars at the intersection or oncoming intersection. You know the pedestrians. So think about how that completely rethink about intelligent transportation system in the city. Now let's just flip that conversation to healthcare. We had demonstrated, actually, as we launched 5G in the UK, we had 5G connected ambulances. So first responders, when you go to a site, if you have that 5G connected ambulance, you have the ability to do advanced imaging exams like an ultrasound exam within the ambulance, and just send that image in real time to doctors that can analyze and do the entire diagnostics before you get to the hospital. And that's now add to that the whole evolution of telemedicine. And you can change the conversation to how we think about many other services in the city. Utility companies, for example, are building a digital twin of the power grid using 5G. So it's a big transformation, and that's a glimpse of what a smart city will look like in the future.
Absolutely. And I think you also chatted about kind of what it means to actually work with municipalities on that. Who are the people that actually have to kind of work together, and what are those roles? Before we pass it over to David, I'd be remiss if I didn't also ask you about rural communities. Clearly, this is an event around smart cities, but we talk a lot about smart cities and less about these areas. Just real fast, how do you think about extending this digital transformation to those communities?
One of the topics that often come up in conversations, and just look in the United States right now, is how do you get broadband to rural areas? And it's been, a problem that's been around for a very long time and in need of a solution. The good news is 5G is for the first time, you have a wireless technology that operators can economically provide broadband replacement or augmentation. You couldn't do that with 4G. It was too expensive, especially because we are moving towards an unlimited data society. So now you have, with 5G, you have one thing that happens is you have the lower cost per bit and the performance that allow you to use cellular to augment broadband. The second is you have the ability now to have the reach with this technology to some of the rural areas. We have done a lot of demonstrations, break the barriers of 7 kilometer distance, and moving towards like 10 kilometer distance with high performance 5G. And we have a number of engagements right now of companies designing products for rural broadband using 5G. Excellent.
Thank you so much for joining us. Congratulations on your move into CEO. We're glad to partner with you. Thanks for your time, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, David Pierce, and his panel. Thanks again, Christiana.
Hey, everybody. Like she said, my name is David Pierce. I'm the editor-at-large at Protocol. Thanks again, Tammy and Cristiano. That was great. And let's see. We have a bunch of awesome people here, and rather than have me say nice things about you, I'm going to make you say nice things about yourselves. So let's just go in the order I can see you. Jordan, you go first. Tell us a little bit about who you are.
Thanks, David. My name is Jordan Davis. I'm the Executive Director of Smart Columbus. We were the winner in 2016 of the U.S. Department of Transportation's Smart Cities Challenge.
Awesome. Jeremy, you're up next.
Hi, thanks. I'm Jeremy Goldberg. I lead worldwide strategy for critical infrastructure at Microsoft, and joined Microsoft in January after spending 8 years in public service, most recently the state of New York. Prior to that, the New York City Mayor's Office, San Francisco City Hall, and the city of San Jose. Great to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you. And Jonathan, our slightly mysteriously backlit friend.
Sorry about that. Hi, I'm Jonathan Weiner. I'm one of the co-founders and co-CEOs of Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners. We are an organization that partners with municipalities and infrastructure owners to build next generation infrastructure using technology. We were spun out of Alphabet, the technology company.
Awesome. Okay, so I think to start, I want to do something that might feel sort of overly basic, but it feels useful, which is I want to talk about what we talk about when we talk about smart cities. Because I think if you rewind like 10 years ago, all of the conversations I was having with people about smart cities were about these like big whiz bang technologies, and everything was going to have sensors, and there were going to be, flying cars above us. And it was just a whole different conversation than the one that I feel like we're having now. And in talking with all of you, it sounds like you're kind of thinking about that way too. So Jeremy, since you got involved in some of the Twitter fights that people had with us over the last week or so, you start sort of give me how you think about what we mean when we talk about smart cities.
There's no fighting on Twitter. What are you talking about? No, I think it's important discourse to have, right? I mean, the prompt really was about, technology as an enabler, right? About, the human-centric nature of what technology can enable. And I experienced it firsthand, working in cities and working at the state of New York, really learned like the ups and downs and the ebbs and flows of, what was really resonating with the public. Because ultimately what it comes down to is that what makes a city smart isn't the technology as such, right? And I wrote about this recently too. It's the degree to which the technology gives residents better lives. Businesses can thrive, and governments that provide great service. And so the success of smart cities really rests on our foresight, taking a look back at what we saw, what we experienced, and building for accessibility and solutions that can adapt as conditions and priorities change, just very much so in the way that we experienced over this past year during the pandemic.
Jordan, does that sound right to you?
I resonate completely with that. I think the hype curve certainly was at its peak 5 years ago of what was possible. And I think cities like Columbus and others who've begun to ground truth where the technology is have started to really get where the rubber meets the road of is this desirable by residents? How is this impacting quality of life? And so 100% the future of this conversation needs to be rooted back towards the human experience and how this improves the quality of life in cities.
Okay. And Jonathan, I know we've talked a couple of times about this in the past, so I know you see it sort of the same way, but I'm curious how you think about why that change has happened. Like even as the tech has gotten better and things like the Internet of Things have gone from this sort of like bananas thing that seemed impossible to a lot of that stuff actually works. It does feel like we've brought the conversation sort of way back down to earth, both sort of literally and figuratively. What do you make of that? How did we get to kind of where we are right now?
Well, look, first of all, I agree with both Jeremy and Jordan in that, technology is only useful insofar as it's improving residents' experience, improving quality of life, making essential services more sustainable, more reliable, more inclusive. So again, you really need to be rooted in that. But how did the conversation go from the Gartner hype curve of smart city to really practical applications? I think there's a tension involved in trying to deploy technology to impact critical services in urban environments. And that tension is that in many types of the infrastructure systems that provide these types of services, the development cycle and the asset life is so long of an electric grid, of a road. And municipalities have to make billion-dollar or multi-billion-dollar bets on 20-year fixed assets that have to provide critical services to their communities. And that moves at a certain pace. And then there's technology innovation that moves at a very, very different pace. And it is true that there are going to be and there are innovations with respect to technologies that can impact those systems and make them more effective for residents. But lining those two things up, it's not going to happen magically. It's sort of enough technology gets tested in places like Columbus, the rubber meets the road. There are precedents that are shown to be effective, incremental iteration that happens over time. And then, some forward-looking municipalities take the bet that they actually can provide better services using technology, and it sort of proliferates. But, as much as I would, like my Jetsons car, things don't happen in 5-year horizons, particularly when you're talking about, large physical assets.
David, if I may just jump in on Jonathan hits on a really important point that on the multi-billion-dollar investments in terms of road infrastructure, for example, right? So to succeed, right, with our past and our present kind of cities in mind, the future is about the blending, right, of those technologies with the existing infrastructure. And so that's the way that we can tackle a lot of these, tangibly, I think a lot of the pressing issues around sustainability, economic opportunity. And, when you build that way for strong, flexible, digital infrastructure that integrates, that new technology into the existing roads or built environment, that's where you'll start to see those success.
Yeah. So, and the timelines thing is actually one of the sort of core pieces of this I want to talk a lot about, because I think an interesting challenge has been, like you just said, that tech and cities work on very different timelines and they have very different purposes and very different goals. And I think there's been this push in a lot of places for cities and governments to learn how to run at tech speeds. And part of me wonders if that's even possible. And part of me wonders if that's even the right goal for these groups to have. So Jordan, having been through a lot of, I'm assuming, what was sort of messy timeline planning and trying to figure out how to implement all this stuff over the last 5 years, what is your sense of kind of how those two sides can or even should meet in the middle?
Well, I mean, whenever you're in community work, you have to balance the feasibility of a timeline, but also the political momentum needs that you have to balance. And I think the expectations of both residents and political, leaders is one of the most complicated parts of navigating and setting expectations. I think the rate of change when you can have a blue ribbon moment helps a lot of people build momentum and continued support for these types of investments. And so we need those short-term wins at key milestones along the way. Anyone that says you don't is not trying to manage a political agenda. But I think you want to consider that. I think there are things you can create that help force those things. But at the end of the day, a lot of these investments are longer term. So the aspect of pilots and prototypes is certainly, from the tech space and is coming into government and community in a lot of different ways. I think you're going to see innovation, spreading beyond a one office in this next decade throughout cities. But that is still not at scale. And in a community and in a government world, you serve everyone. And so I think that's another dimension that we constantly have to navigate is who is the resident that we're working with and targeting and who's going to be benefited by that, set the expectations with the right micro communities as we start to do this more iterative kind of innovative work. It is not a one size fits all per project or per use case, but those are some of the higher level learnings on our end, at least.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, and I think part of the challenge there is you get a company like Google or Microsoft or whoever who can spend a lot of money on projects that may or may not work, and the sort of risk reward proposition is so different that Jeremy, having been on both sides of this pretty recently, I'm even curious, sort of going to a company like Microsoft, was it a total sort of head shock culture change to figure out how to think like a tech company instead of think like a city CTO?
Not at all. Not at all. I think the hardest part was obviously the move from being in person in an office every day to moving to a hybrid environment and work from home environment where you have other issues to contend with, kids running around in the background of your meetings, that kind of thing. But the point that Jordan raises around government working for everyone and needs to work for everyone, that when technology moves at a pace that government is not going to move in terms of speed, or government attempts to do that, and this is my impression and my experience has been that we are most certainly going to be leaving people behind, citizens and residents. And so that begs to ask the question really about accessibility. And so in joining Microsoft and looking at the commitments that they've made to inclusive and accessible, approaches to design and the way that they engage with government, to me, it was very clear that making this transition into Microsoft was the right place for me in terms of the role and the work that I get to do. So if you imagine for a second, in this current kind of hybrid remote work from home culture that I just referenced, that we all have experienced, inclusive technology is even more crucial than ever for people and for government workers to be able to access employment, education, social services, all of the different things that government must deliver for people. And so when you have, for example, 1 billion plus people across the globe that have disabilities, but only 1 in 10 have access to the technology products they need, we have a lot of work to do. So if we move too quickly, we're most certainly leaving many, many people behind. And that's part of the commitment that we'll continue to make in terms of our role and the work that I'm doing in Microsoft, is ensuring that accessibility is a core part of the work that we do with the public sector.
Okay. But this goes back to, and I promise I will leave this issue alone here in a second, but I was just thinking about the who is it, Marshall McLuhan, that said the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. If not, sorry for butchering that quote. But I think that's just a thing people in tech are comfortable with, right? That at first there's sort of this belief that in the limits of time, things will become available to more people, right? And that's been true over time. But I think when you're working in a governmental capacity or for a city and trying to sort of approach everyone all the time, it doesn't seem like the right approach to just say, well, this is going to be for the people who can afford it, and then in 10 years, it's going to be really rad for everybody. That just doesn't, I don't know, I have a hard time sort of marrying those two things in my head.
Yep, it's very difficult, right? And I think sometimes, and I experience this as the customer, right? Coming in, into Microsoft, the experience that I had as the customer before, where you're being, presented with an ideal, right? The technology will solve the problems, right, for said group or population. While in the reality of the day-to-day, there are things that need to be done to solve an immediate problem that's on the list of a CIO or a CTO or an elected official. And working towards solving those immediate things that kind of demonstrate I think what Jordan articulated around getting those wins, right? To test things out, do proofs of concept, getting a sense from, rapid prototyping, finding new ways of like delivering these solutions. To me, that's where I come at it from, and working with some of our engineering teams and working with some of our sales teams in the field is really rethinking the way that we approach the customer, the public sector, and kind of fine tuning the way that we show up, which is not leading with the technology to solve it, but really unpacking the business problem that will hopefully get the scale that we need through the products that we have.
I can actually give a few direct examples to this. So one was the autonomous shuttles that we've deployed in Columbus. We've deployed 2 different shuttles, 2 different companies, 2 different use cases. The grant funded one, which had a lot more requirements of documentation and the like, was going to be very delayed because of a series of timelines. To your earlier point, David, how do you manage that? But that one was intended to serve a lower income neighborhood for a first mile, last mile solution. But we knew that technology was so new that could it even serve a really dependent use case? So the other thing about this with emerging technology is when you set an expectation with a resident, any lack of delivery on that expectation has a global impact on furthering trust issues with government, right? So you have to take it very seriously that we are communicating the right expectation and delivering to the best of our ability to meet that. Emerging technology has a lot of broken promises in history. So we put private sector money along with the state money to run a pilot first. And we learned a lot. And yeah, there were a lot of broken promises in that first pilot, but we did it on a very low risk use case. It was a teaching and learning tool downtown for visitors, right? Like if it wasn't an autonomy and it didn't come at 10 a.m. on Tuesday because it was raining, like nobody was going to miss work. But then once we flipped it to the neighborhood, we could better balance expectations of what it was and speed and time. And I think that's really, really important of how we manage and maybe balance and learn and be very thoughtful about what use cases we try and solve for and make sure we can actually solve that problem in a reliable way. The second component I would say is a good example of this early adopter equity dynamic is in the emergence of electric vehicles. We've spent 3-4 years really driving forth promotion of adoption of electric vehicles as a primary lever for achieving climate change. The adoption of that new technology, has an infrastructure component to it, but it is a high cost point of entry, right? So it is for the traditional early adopter, high tech, educated, et cetera. And so as one of the key deliverables for getting to climate neutrality, electrifying the transportation sector, is it just the rich people that it contribute to that? That's just not it's not an acceptable answer. So you're seeing governments try and figure out how do we bring equity to this? And I think that's a big part of where public and private partnership really can work together. Is a lot of times the private sector is public sector is trying to come up with answers to force fit a private sector solution to an equity answer. And I think we could be a lot more creative with the private sector if they were at the table in those conversations, right? Where does charging go? What does the future of this look like? What does car sharing look like for marginalized communities? So there's just a lot there where I think there's a push and pull sometimes where things aren't so market driven and not so directed by a vendor relationship from a city's perspective.
Yeah, that makes sense. Jonathan, I know you've spent a lot of time talking to folks about that balance and the balance between sort of doing the not necessarily low-hanging fruit, but kind of the obvious infrastructural stuff versus being sort of big and experimental. What do you make of that balance and how hard it is to strike?
So I agree with a lot of things that have been said, obviously. I do think to pick up on something that Jordan said and to talk about some of the situations which we found there really be great alignment between early pilots and increased equity and inclusion. I really think we need to think hard about government procurement and how government procurement has to change in light of the opportunities for innovation that technology brings. I think historically too much of procurement is viewed as sort of making sure the government's getting a fair deal, getting the cheapest implementation, rather than thinking about the outcomes that they're trying to achieve. And so to Jordan's point, if I have an equity and inclusion outcome, maybe I as the city don't necessarily care which technology is used to achieve that outcome, but maybe I would like to compensate whoever my partner is based upon achieving, that outcome that I have. And also to Jeremy's point, it speaks to having a real human need, not just a vendor selling gadgets because people want to buy gadgets. And there was a comment made earlier, I think it might have been Jordan, but it also could have been Jeremy, because I think we're all saying very similar things, which is that you really need a public sector partner who is going to embrace the opportunity to provide better services and, quite frankly, stick their neck out a little bit, because there have been a lot of broken promises that come with technology, and you need partners. And the way we found to do that is to have a slightly different approach to procurement, where we try and co-create projects with municipalities, where we're trying to speak specifically to the outcomes that municipalities want to have, and then to look for a public sector partner for whom this isn't issue number 5 on their list, but it's issue number 1 on their list. And just to give you a few concrete examples where I think this is lined up really well. Last year we built the largest residential virtual power plant in California. So we basically were subsidizing smart devices to go into homes. Over 30% of the homes they went into were low-income homes who happened to say yes, that they'd like to participate in this. They are then able to aggregate them up, and during peak moments of demand in California, where we've seen all the crises on the grid, we can actually adjust the demand response of the grid, with people's consent and buy-in, and they get a reduction on their energy bill. So this was top of mind for the government of California last year after the electric grid went down. This wasn't issue number 4 for them. This is COVID is probably issue number 1, but this was a top 3 issue for them. Likewise, we did this, we're building it right now, but we announced a while ago a first of its kind roadway, a lot of sensors, and a lot of gadgets on the road. And the use case, however, was increased public transit on the corridor between Detroit and Ann Arbor. And in that case, our public sector partner at the state level, Governor Whitmer, had literally campaigned on fix the damn roads. That was the campaign slogan. That was a top priority for her. We recently did a borderless classroom where we're using a version of 5G networking to create ubiquitous coverage within a community for borderless classroom, so that a student can get the same high-speed internet at the classroom as they get at their home. Again, if we've been talking to someone 3 years ago about that use case, it's great. No one's going to say like that's not important. But during COVID, when there was inequity between the people who actually could access education, who happened to have fiber to the home, and those who had crappy cell service, it became a top priority. And so you do need to align with truly impactful outcomes in order to get the right type of partnership to do a different type of procurement, to actually co-create a solution.
Okay, I think to some extent, though, this goes back to what you were saying, Jordan, about political agendas, right? And I think part of the challenge of some of this stuff is that these projects take a long time, and they're not necessarily stable from administration to administration, and priorities change and the world changes. And I would think part of the big risk for Columbus or any city is to sort of invest deeply in a project only to have someone 4 years from now decide they don't care and come pull the plug, and then 4 years later come start it over, and you just end up on this sort of nasty cycle of never actually finishing a project. Is that is that a risk you run? Does it make you think sort of more short term, just in terms of like things we can get done before somebody takes it away from us?
I can't really speak to that in a very tangible way. I mean, it's always a threat, right? Political cycles are always a threat for changing agendas. I think really strong communities have an anchored plan, a very strong planning organization that puts a future forward vision of where they want corridors and planning. And so there are some anchor kind of priorities typically in a community. We certainly have that. And that does help facilitate and prioritize where federal dollars are what federal dollars we're going to go after, what roadway developments are we going to prioritize. And so there is some general rigor on knowing that. I think oftentimes the challenge is my 5-year bid in like construction process, and then learning about a technology I should have considered 3 years into that, and then having a really hard time adapting for, or being willing to say, I'm going to disrupt or maybe add a year to incorporate this because it's the better long-term decision. And how do I stop midstream to make those future-proof decisions? I think that is a real tension. And then just knowing what to future-proof and how much to spend on that. I mean, just the 5G conversation alone, 5G DSRC for connected vehicles, which way do you go? I mean, just that decision is really hard for cities to make a bet on.
Yeah,
David, on that point, like it's a really important point. It's something that I wrestled with too when I was working in city government. The short term and the long term, right? So when you set out, for example, in San Francisco, when I worked there, our CIO, Jay Nath, created this program called Startup in Residence, and it had the buy-in from the executive, right? The mayor of San Francisco and the leadership saw the value because they saw that we want to prove and demonstrate our innovative nature of the way that we do business. At the same time, we were able to spell out the value proposition in terms of the impact that could be made. We weren't talking about 100 people in terms of the type of problems we were setting out to solve. We were talking about tens of thousands of people, right? We're running these efforts to really provide value, and at a cost, right? If we factor in the cost kind of part of the ROI for the city, at a better price point in terms of procuring the services from a startup in that case. In New York City, NYCX, the work that we worked on, many of us, which continues, today, out of the mayor's office of the CTO, again had the executive buy-in and the investments that were made not only from the mayor's office, but the New York City Economic Development Corporation. And so, when you can triangulate and bring the right buy-in and support and demonstrate that you're focused on issues in New York, for example, around cybersecurity and small businesses, that will resonate because that issue is not going away. Cybersecurity, the support of small businesses, especially in these times, those are the types of things and selection of problems to solve that for the longer term are smart bets for government to make. And frankly, I don't really think all that risky for executives to sort of say, we're willing to invest our time and energy into those topics.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, let's get a little more sort of tactical and on the ground here. And one of the things I went through and basically tried to go back to through all the conversations I've had about this stuff and all the stuff I've read about this stuff and figure out, like, if I'm thinking about smart cities, what are sort of the biggest buckets people are interested in? And the three that I came up with are transportation/mobility, whichever you want to call it, connectivity, and cybersecurity, which is not one I would have talked to a lot of people about 5 years ago, but now seems very top of mind. Jonathan, what am I missing?
I think there's a lot of focus also on the energy grid and sustainability. And if we are going to change the mix of generation in this country, what that's going to mean, both on the generation side, but then once you get down to the distribution level, as there's increased electrification, how you marry those two things, I think is a very complicated question. So I'd put that up there as a really important one. And one that I think people don't talk enough about, but I think will increasingly be important, will be water over the next decade, and trying to understand how communities can get access to clean, reliable water, because we really have underinvested in that infrastructure in this country, and the growth in this country has been in places, in many cases, that have the least access to clean and reliable water.
Okay, Jordan, anything you would add to the list?
Sustainability for sure. Would just double emphasize that. We've selected our next priorities. We've also included digitalization, which is a slightly different take on connectivity, but is really the modernization of the community experience. So seamless integration, mobile payments, digital divide, ensuring every resident has access to the internet. So that's an important human-centered way of communicating the connectivity value.
I like it. Jeremy, anything to add?
There are a few, but I would say that thank you for referencing cybersecurity, because 5 years ago, the folks that are working on IT security issues in government on a city level or state level, for that matter, would say, pay attention to us, right? Because here are the things, the vulnerabilities and the risks that we see with all these smart city deployments, for example. In thinking about what I would add to it, really it's more around the investment in the human capital within government. I would say having partners, right? So you want your private sector partners to be able to be there with you as a public sector entity as you're going through these programs and these initiatives. Government ought to really invest more in terms of the talent that it's seeking to keep and retain and to work on these issues, because a lot of our products, a lot of the things that are out there from across technology, like the industry, presume a great degree or higher level of maturity around DevOps. And I think that's an area where skills building around our talent within government is really critical, will help to see a lot more of these efforts succeed.
I like it. Yeah, and to the sort of basic IT point, one of the things that has struck me in the course of a lot of these conversations is thinking about when we think about the smart city, we tend to think about sort of the outside infrastructure of the city. But part of me is like, well, what if we just didn't worry about that for a minute and focused on the fact that everyone in government is like using old computers and old systems, and people can't access their unemployment systems because they break when a lot of people try to use them. And we've seen over the last year or so that these systems are so fragile. And is that part of this conversation as we think about what a smarter, more digital city should look like? Jeremy, I know you've written in the past about wanting to make it easier for people to access their government and using digital tools to do that. Why isn't that a bigger part of this conversation, I guess?
I believe it is. It's sort of the foundational piece for all of it, right? The cloud enablement for all of these things that we know can be done, that are possible. Now, moving from an on-prem legacy environment for any agency, any entity, and Jonathan was referencing like utilities, for example, you got to think about it from the mindset of the individual who's working in that agency and has for decades, who knows how to operate and run that environment in a way that you or I do not. And when it comes to moving off of an on-prem legacy system, it's sort of the unknown knowns, right? It's, is it worthwhile for me to stick my neck out and say, I'm willing to adopt cloud and begin this digital transformation journey? Or would I rather just sort of keep it safe, right? Because the OT and IT workloads, all the telemetry, all these things I'm looking at as a water utility, let's say, the vulnerabilities, I expose myself not only as an employee, but I'm putting potentially data at risk. So overcoming that initial, inertia, inherent kind of fear, to be able to begin on that path is tricky. And it takes, it's not a 1 or 2 year or 3 year process in most cases for agencies to move those workloads off of legacy. So it's not, and there's no silver bullet, or one of my colleagues would say, kind of an easy button. And so it's central to the overall topic, themes, things that we're discussing, and it is that foundational layer.
Okay, fair enough. Jordan, is this something you've been thinking a lot about with Columbus?
Yeah, I mean, during the pandemic, we had a crowdsourced community of technologists, about 1,200, that came to bear for government to use to solve different problems and build different solutions. I mean, everything from, hey, I need a COBOL developer because they didn't have any, but their code language was written in that, to Electron websites, to, going into the cloud. I mean, there's so many things that just have seen its time, and it's hard to make the leap. I think one of the other aspects that we have watched the city try and navigate is kind of the centralization of a data plan for the community. And one of the things that I think vendors continuously are going to run into is, a lot of people have gone through procurement based off of the RFP requirements into one department, and then sold the analytics dashboard for that single solution. And that's just not going to be the way of operating, in the future. They want integrated views. They want to know the interdependencies of these different things. And so the interoperability requirements, I think, are going to get more sophisticated by governments, because they know that they are going to want that data to view for a lot of different operational reasons. I hope we get to a place where the operational reasons transcend departments. I think we're still predominantly siloed across governments, particularly in local governments, but state governments are the same as well. But I do think there's going to be an internal centralization and interoperability mandate that we'll start to see across communities at scale.
Okay. Yeah, Jonathan, I remember the first time you and I ever talked, you were saying one of your grandest goals was just to make it possible for governments to share data with each other and internally, and that felt like a weirdly huge task, but a pretty obvious one. Does it still feel that way?
We're touching on a bunch of different things, and it's funny because they all built on some suppositions that are common. So we started out, we were talking about, critical infrastructure systems, how you build roads, utility plants, and those are increasingly becoming digitized, and therefore you can, find gains both in quality of service and lowering costs. And that's sort of a whole evolution that's sort of happening on the one side. And then we started talking a little bit about how individuals actually experience their government. Like, how do I find out where I can get a vaccine? Or take a recent example, or other ways in which I might have to get a permit to do something, pay my taxes, whatever it is. And that field generally referred to as GovTech, and we can talk all about it. And then behind all of this, though, is the dream that one day the people who have been making decisions about how to optimize the organization of the city, the municipality, would be able to be making those decisions informed by data from all of these various different components, and that you could have huge gains in the quality of life that you'd be able to deliver. That's going to be a very long time. For a number of reasons. Changing workflows is really hard, really unclear who should do this, how this could be secure, how people would buy in. This is going to be a very long-term evolution, but at some point in the future, we probably get there. I think one thing that, and I think Jordan just used this phrase, maybe it wasn't data plan, but effectively like a data architecture, so that if a municipality could think through the policies of how they want to share data, what they think is appropriate, how they could potentially leverage the cloud, and to do so through an exercise of getting buy-in across agencies, that would be profoundly impactful. I suspect it would be very challenging just practically to do, and I do think this is a place where the public sector is going to have to lean in, not the private sector, because it's really, quite frankly, my personal view is not for us to tell a municipality how they should organize the data, what data should be used. That's the community's data, and the government should figure out, what it wants to use to, make accessible to the private sector for some reasons, or maybe not, but government has to lead here. And unfortunately, on the list of things that are critical for society, fixing databases and moving them to the cloud and retraining people to use new types of tools on new devices somehow is always not at the top of the list. And so I think it's just a challenge.
It's not very politically sexy, databases, historically speaking, I would say. But it does seem like, is that the sort of thing that we eventually might have, I don't know, some bigger like federal regulation for? Like, should there be one answer for kind of how governments collect and share and store data? Or is this the kind of thing that's going to have to be decided by, every town, city, and state in the country?
I don't think there's a simple answer to that question. There are probably some things that would be well served by federal regulation, although I think the vast majority of this does have to take place at the municipal level. Now, people will be inspired by different models. You'll see some communities that gravitate towards one type of model, and different communities gravitate towards a different one. But this is really a decision for the community about what type of services do they want to take advantage of, and what compromises or changes are they willing to make with respect to data to have more efficient services, and that is a municipal issue in my mind, not one that could be effectively legislated federally.
There are plenty of great communities and people, chief data officer networks across the country. For example, one that the Ash Institute at Harvard organizes. And so there are really exemplary examples of cities that are doing this in North America and beyond that have laid out a lot of these frameworks around data standards and data quality. And I think a lot of those networks remain really important. What Jonathan talks about or related to the kind of the data siloing and the issues that we know are back office problems within government, really has a lot more, and in fact, to do with just digitalizing processes, right? That's where we're looking at that question you asked earlier, David, about the speed of technology. You can jam in a bunch of technology into an environment, but the business processes on the back end aren't going to keep pace. You really don't have much that's going to change. And so that's the data conversation. That's all part of the way that teams collaborate, in government. Technology has, a role in that. But we see where there's improvement to be made. I think it's on the digitalization of the way that business is done in the back office.
Okay. Jordan, it strikes me that one of the things underlying all of this is just that it would be very hard to know where to start, because there are so many things to do. There are so many sort of big things that it's like, if you could just fast forward 20 years and rewrite everything, even if it's maybe obvious what you would do, it could be very hard to figure out how to sort of sequence those things. And having been through this in a very real way over the last several years, like what is that process where you sit down and say, okay, this is a thing we've identified as a priority. We have some resources to do it. Where do we start? Like, how do you even decide?
I think at the end of the day, it's the easiest when the mayor uses his or her bully pulpit to say, this is my top priority. That moves mountains, just like what Jonathan was saying before. When a city has a clear, or an elected official has a clear priority, it's easy to know how to fit in and to partner, right? So that's absolutely a stacking of priorities immediately. I think the second, what I see a lot, we've explored, smart streetlights and smart infrastructure. And then when you pull a lot of departments together, it's like, well, what sensors go on it? If you can only put 5, who wants the use cases and what are those priorities? And I think that is the exact friction point, right? Is that everybody has different utility value for these assets, and there's not an easy way to negotiate what's more important than the other. But that really is the nature of government, and you have to figure out, well, what's feasible, what timeline, what costs, and how reliable is it? I do think, though, increasingly in the smart city space, a lot of priorities of spend will be dictated by resident use case. I think what we proved with the Smart City Challenge, which really introduced the mobility piece very foundationally into the smart city movement by the federal government, it gave a direct resident relationship to technology. Because before, it was very much the GovTech internal government efficiency data piece. And if you looked at Barcelona's use cases and studies, it's one of the reasons why, there was a big change in their strategy, was because it didn't have a lot of relationship to the resident. And as a result, those big flashy numbers of big investments with Cisco and the like didn't lay well with residents, because they're like, well, what did I get for it, right? And so I think more and more the priorities are going to be set with a negotiation between, well, what brings the resident value, and how do we make sure we deliver on that? And then operational efficiencies will come as a defense to achieving that.
And do you feel like that conversation is an easy one to have productively with sort of involving residents from the very beginning? It makes sense to me that that's the right thing to do, but I can imagine that adds sort of even more wrinkles to this process of figuring out what to do and for whom and in what order. And I don't know, it just seems like a challenge. You just add more people to the fire there.
I mean, the traditional engagement models won't work, right? The one-way communication models of telling you what we've decided and, let me know what opinions you have on this pretty much baked idea isn't gonna work. So, human-centered design approaches that, have grown in popularity over the years, and really Bloomberg Philanthropies has certainly been working tremendously with communities to embed this methodology in innovation offices and in sustainability programs. Certainly, I think has proven its value and shown what's possible. Now, how do you systemically integrate that into cities, I think, is one of the greatest challenges. We often outsource a lot of community engagement work because it is very labor intensive and it's very trust driven. So it's not just the city governments that are going to be responsible for the resident listening, right? And the resident co-design. That's going to have to be a full community effort. So nonprofits being right on the front lines, community foundations, helping be shepherds of community need. So I think it's just a totally different way of thinking about getting the input. But it could be extremely productive because I think it'll be more desirable in the end. Like, I think all of it becomes wanted, used and useful.
Jeremy, you were just nodding like you agree with that.
Yeah, well, as cities work to address, beyond, kind of the COVID pandemic, it's really important that they include resident voices, citizen voices in this process, and specifically going back to something I mentioned earlier around accessibility, in urban planning, and ensuring that technology, supports people with disabilities, or the risks associated with widening the digital divide if you don't. And that in particular, I think, is really an important detail and takeaway, because when cities, for example, implement cloud services, let's say digital wayfinding, they can ensure, I believe, as part of the process, that these new experiences are inclusive and don't leave someone behind. I think there's some great examples out there. Some of the work Microsoft has done with G3 ICT and their smart cities work and the World Economic Forum about model ICT policy around accessibility. So I think those inputs and insights around community engagement, whether they make the process longer or not, those details, the unintended consequences of not including, accessibility or the voices of the people in the process, will leave a city, I think, in a far worse situation than if they do.
Okay, Jonathan, what do you think about all this?
I can only speak from our experience for when we've been successful in pursuing bold projects. Almost always, when we are responding to an RFP or putting in an unsolicited bid to partner municipality, we have dozens of local community partners up front. The local university, if they have an innovation lab, we're often reaching out to see how can we align with the curriculum that they're teaching, the local business community, the local, environmental rights community, the local labor community. If you have a bold vision for something that you believe a community needs and you can't get a group of local community organizations to partner with you to help define it, then you probably haven't touched on a real need. And so the only other thing I would just say, sort of generally about this, that the hardest thing about the smart cities conversation is it's very easy to understand what an ideal end state would look like, what the Jetsons future is like. If you want me to tell you what an electric grid of the future should look like, I can tell you about how many different sensors we're going to need to be able to understand the distribution grid. We're going to have a bunch of edge servers there that are going to be orchestrating some distributed energy resources, entering into a transactive energy market, back into the, the bulk generation market. And you know what, that's not a particularly profound thing, because if you go talk to a bunch of people who are investing in innovations related to the electric grid, they'll all have the same vision. Now go out there and try and actually deal with the regulation of that utility, the business process of that utility, the fact that we don't actually kind of have ubiquitous 5G yet, so you can't put the sensors out there yet, so we don't know. And then you need the homeowners to be able to okay with people, deciding how their car gets charged. The whole thing, we know what the end state and we know the power of that end state would be. But if you go out there and you simply try and say, we're going to build to the end state, you're not going to be able to put it in terms that a community is going to get excited about. And like we said this whole time, we're not going to deliver on the timeline that's going to matter. So you have to show quick wins, show quick value. And that's why, when we want, it's not that we don't have a vision 10, 15 years from now about what the electric grid could be, but a really easy solution was just put a bunch of Nest thermostats in people's home and ask them, hey, there's going to be a power outage. Are you okay if I change your temperature 2 degrees for an hour tomorrow? Click yes, click no. And if you click yes, I'll give you, a buck every time you say yes. Like that, everyone can get around. I get a lower electric bid and the power doesn't go out. And it starts building both the trust that technology can actually have a real outcome, but also educating the community as to why we care about trying to implement these things. So it's just this huge tension between knowing there are huge goals out there and what can we do tangibly today to create value in a community.
So it kind of sounds like what you're saying is basically, rather than say, trust us, this is going to take a while, but it's going to be amazing, which is, I think, a lot of people's sort of default strategy is like, we're in this for a long term. It's a big investment, but we're going to get there. You're kind of saying, do that. And this is, I guess, what Jordan was saying a while ago too, is like, do that, but also find ways to solve problems along the way. Like you can't just solve one problem. You have to solve a lot of problems on the way to solving the big problem.
You have to earn the trust. I mean, it's one thing to have community engagement, and that'll get you so far in the sense that you go out and you really listen to people and try and solve a problem. But if you don't deliver for them, you don't build trust, you don't earn the right to continue to partner with them.
Okay, I like it. So we have like 5 minutes left, and at the risk of ending on an impossibly huge, broad question, I want to talk just really quick about sort of this moment that we're in right now, because we're coming out of a pandemic that I think changed a lot of people's ideas about how the world around them is supposed to work and how they interact with it. There's also this giant, still slightly mysterious infrastructure bill floating around that could mean there's a lot of money flowing into projects like the ones that we're talking about. And again, I know this is an impossibly broad question, so just bear with me. But as we look towards really like the next 12 months, even 12, 24 months, what's kind of top of mind for you guys as like a real dent we can start to make in this moment that feels sort of crucial right now? And I guess let's just go back down the line here. So, Jordan, you have the unfortunate job of going first with my impossibly huge question.
I think it is a non-negotiable, but I think we have to solve the digital divide. Period. Like it should not exist.
Fair enough. Jeremy, what about you?
Well, I just did a cross-country road trip, so I was on all the throughways and all the amazing roads that kind of connect our country. And so the timing of the critical infrastructure topic and conversation and the bill that you just referenced, like in the U.S. to support a range of different investments. It's one thing to pass, right, with the legislation and then start to do the distribution of the dollars across critical needs. So I'm hopeful those things will take place most certainly within the next 6 months. Over the next 12 months, what I'd really like to see is an additional approach and kind of and investment in terms of the strategic investments that government is making in technology. And what I mean by that is the decisions that governments are making now in terms of cloud adoption, if they go, to go with Azure, for example, if they're going to make those investments now, great, because those impacts will be, seen 3, 4, 5, 10 years down the road if we do not, right? So I'd like to see more of a proactive kind of posture on strategic investments in tech that are really about like the digitalization of government.
I like it. I will say, I can't believe you didn't. I just teed you up to like make the appeal for cybersecurity, and you just totally left me hanging on it.
No, we can come back round 2. That and procurement should be the next set of topics, right?
Fair enough. I'll take it. Jonathan, what about you?
Very briefly, I think it's digital divide, and just to bring it back to where the Qualcomm conversation started. We're right now designing these networks, and we're making choices about how 5G is going to be implemented. $67 billion in that bipartisan bill. We need to make sure that that's being used to design more inclusive and more open networks. And those architectural decisions happen in the next 6 months, even if it takes the next 4 years to roll out. And with that federal money, we need to be really thinking about how municipalities can ensure that, you know, next generation wireless is inclusive. And one optimistic note to maybe end on that, you know, if you told me 5 years ago there'd be an infrastructure bill and that broadband would be in it, that's not obvious. Like, broadband wasn't infrastructure 5 years ago. And the mere fact that was one of the major pieces of this bill, I think is encouraging.
Biggest legacy of the pandemic. It could be one of the biggest societal things we do as a result of this, I think.
I like it. Awesome. Well, we are out of time, but thank you all so much for doing this. This was incredibly fun. I feel like we only approached like 0.25% of all the stuff there is to talk about smart cities. So we're gonna have to come back and do this again. But again, thank you, all of you. Thanks to everyone who watched. I really appreciate it. And we look forward to doing this again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.